For the third weekend in a row, McLaren have been superseded, and in Singapore, they only had the third fastest car throughout the weekend. This is a team that during the mid-portion of the season had 4 consecutive 1-2 finishes in a row, and the only reason that number isn't 5 is because Lando retired from P2 in Zandvoort. To see them go winless since that race and genuinely be outclassed by the likes of Red Bull and Mercedes would have seemed almost unthinkable. However, the big question is what is behind this recent turnaround, and is this just something that has been circuit specific or actually a worrying trend for the rest of the season? McLaren's biggest weakness since the beginning of the season has been tracks with short, slow-speed corners and bumpy braking zones. This is mainly because, from a driving perspective, the McLaren suffers from a weak front end around these types of corners, which leads to massive understeer and saps the confidence out of the drivers. The tyres, which were also altered for this season, have also had an effect, because as Lando noted in Singapore, on the medium tyres there was a lot more bite on the front end. However, once the team fitted the soft tyres for those Q3 laps, it dulled the front of the car. Around tracks like Singapore, where there is a massive emphasis on qualifying, those sorts of balance changes absolutely kills a driver's confidence just when they need it most for those all-important soft tyre laps in Q3 in the fight for pole position. When talking about why McLaren lacked performance in Singapore, Andrea Stella said, "When we have braking with big bumps and with curbs, in Canada we were not the best car, in Baku we were not the best car, and in Singapore we are not the best car. This is not an entire surprise because we know which conditions we develop our car. In general, we gain time mid-corner, but every mid-corner on these circuits is kind of too short. Here, it's dominated by braking and traction, and with bumps and curbs, we just seem to be suffering a bit. And our drivers were making comments which resembled the comments of Baku and Canada. So it's a regime in which simply we are not the most competitive." As Stella mentioned, Canada is another one of those tracks that exposed McLaren's weaknesses, and the similarities between the 2 weekends was incredible. The qualifying order for the top 4 was exactly the same, with George taking wins in both races, Max coming home in second, and even Kimi having strong weekends on both tracks. It shows that McLaren has a very clear weakness, and the team knew this going into the race because that is exactly how they chose to develop their car. With these ground effect cars, it is simply impossible to develop a suspension platform that suits every single circuit. McLaren likes tracks with long, fast corners that rewards high downforce, and when you spend more of your time combining your steering and throttle input to rotate your car, and less time where you're combining braking at low speed with sharp steering inputs. The next big major contributing factor is that McLaren stopped developing their car very early into the season. Realistically, once Oscar won 3 races in a row from Bahrain to Miami, we all knew that the Constructors' Championship was essentially over. Not only did McLaren build up a huge points advantage during this time, but they also had 2 top drivers scoring big points, which was in contrast to Red Bull and Mercedes. Speaking about the development of the MCL39, Stella said, "There is a trend whereby we have stopped the development of the car now for quite some time, because we have been focusing entirely on 2026. There were little parts that we took to Monza, but otherwise, we were just focusing on 2026 for a long time, while we have seen that some competitors kept taking some new upgrades. Red Bull certainly is one of those." By dominating the beginning of the season, it gave McLaren the security it needed to switch focus onto 2026 a lot earlier. However, for teams that were struggling with their car, even if the championship wasn't a possibility, there was still an incentive for Red Bull and Mercedes to keep on developing and closing the gap on McLaren, because a lot of the learnings from 25 will still carry over onto 26. Ultimately, that's exactly what led to the other teams becoming more competitive. When McLaren had more performance in hand, they were still able to be competitive on tracks that didn't suit their car as much. But now that Red Bull in particular have continued to develop, making major performance gains within the last few races, McLaren with an underdeveloped car no longer have that luxury. And now, none of this is to say that McLaren still don't have plenty of tracks on which they should be competitive and probably even favourites for. Austin next time out is more similar to Silverstone, which should see McLaren be stronger around those long sweeping corners. even though, surprisingly to me, Stella actually played down their car's competitiveness around that track compared to some of the other remaining tracks. I would expect that Austin will still be a bit of a struggle for us, because the corners are tight in many braking areas. Our tracks still remain the likes of Brazil, Qatar, and Abu Dhabi. At the end of the day, McLaren have left Singapore with the Constructors' title firmly in their trophy cabinet. From a team point of view, the way they have judged this season in terms of car development, and then the way their drivers have executed when the car was dominant, has still been very impressive. Yes, they have left points on the table, but I think that's going to happen when you have two number one drivers who are both going for their first ever driver's title. For drivers like Max, who has been revitalized in the newly upgraded Red Bull, there is very little pressure or even expectation heading into the final few races. For Oscar and Lando, the pressure and scrutiny, however, is only going to increase the closer we get to Abu Dhabi. The controversial first lap collision that we saw in Singapore between the two McLaren drivers, I think, was almost a perfect manifestation of this pressure. Going into T2, Lando was so focused on Oscar and nothing else that he essentially drove into the back of Max when he misjudged his braking, which then also inadvertently sent him crashing into the side of Piastri. You have to admire Lando's aggressiveness, and I'm never going to deter a driver from racing hard. But the more I look back at that incident, the more I think that Lando was incredibly lucky. He came into T2 behind Oscar at the apex, and it was only him crashing into the side of Oscar, which then halted Oscar's momentum as he had to catch the car, that allowed him to accelerate out of the corner faster and overtake him. The drivers are not robots, and as much as the car is the predominant factor in their recent uncompetitiveness, I do think that the drivers also have a part to play in it as well. With less and less opportunity every single weekend, and under massive pressure that none of us can even begin to imagine what it feels like, that is naturally going to cause Oscar and Lando to tighten up on certain tracks out of fear of making a mistake. Add on top of that drivers like Max, George, and even Kimi, who have basically nothing to lose. And all of these factors together have meant that the grid has become a lot more competitive, and McLaren as a team have become a lot more vulnerable in the process. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe, that would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.